Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Is SharePoint the right solution for email management? A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You're welcome to submit questions at any time using the chat window on your screen. We'll address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions, someone will follow up with you shortly via email. If you're interested in trying out the enterprise version of Harmony, please send us a request in the chat window and someone will contact you after the webinar to get you started. We'll also make a recording of the webcast available within a couple of days. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Richard Poole, Chief Technology Officer of EMEA at Harmony. Richard heads up the pre-sales team for Harmony across the EMEA and Asia Pacific regions, working both directly with key accounts as well as Harmony's partner channel. Bringing with him almost 20 years of experience in data management systems, Richard has helped many companies to realize the significant benefits in productivity that collaborative platforms enable. Before joining Harmony in 2011, Richard worked for Dassault Systems PLM for over 10 years. Richard also has a Bachelor of Engineering degree in Automotive Engineering from Loughborough University. Richard, please get us started.
Thank you, Susan, and welcome everybody. So I think the topic for today really is what kind of information do you need to store in the workplace. We can kind of break that down into three main areas. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of documents that people work on in the workplace, and most documents that people are working on are important documents that should be shared and should be centrally managed. And likewise, workflow. It's obviously very, very business orientated around the kind of workflow processes and transactions. But email is a bit of a difficult subject, or a different subject really, because obviously your email, your own mailbox, for example, is a mixture of kind of personal emails and not meaningless emails, but not so important emails, like there's an internal conversation or something. But there is a vast amount of important business information that is discussed and transmitted via email, both internally and externally. So actually, in a kind of from a records point of view in an organization, the vast majority of what should be stored as records is actually emails, much more than the likes of documents and workflow processes. So in terms of storing those emails, different emails have different purposes. Some emails are, like we say, very important. They could be relating to contract negotiation. It could be a change to a design spec, or a change in maybe a building site or something. So here's some examples of instances where emails are important and therefore should be stored centrally so that they can be retrieved in the future, and they're not tied up in people's personal mailboxes. Because I think that's the real difficult thing, is if you can't find those important emails, then you could be losing time, losing money, or losing business as part of that. Now, as you said, there's a big mixture of important emails and not so important emails that shouldn't be stored centrally, that are personal, that should remain in your personal mailbox. So I think some studies have shown that it's about 5% of the emails in your mailbox are actually records that should be stored and retained for future reference. So it's actually quite difficult for an end user to distinguish which of those should be saved and where to save them. There's a number of different technologies to do that, and we're going to have a look at some of those in the session today. So we'd just like to ask a poll question about the kind of consequences that you may see of losing emails or not being able to retrieve them. We'll just give that a few moments to give everyone a chance to respond. I mean, there could be lots of other kind of scenarios where there's a negative impact of not being able to find that critical email that somebody, advised somebody else to do something certain, and if it was a previous employee who's left the company, if you can't find it, you're never going to find it because it's locked up in their mailbox, which is possibly deleted and gone forevermore. So I think we've got a good spread of responses there. So it looks like the vast majority of people have had instances where time is lost, looking for emails or not being able to find them in the first place. But also there's instances where people have lost, money and loss of business as well. And I can think of quite a few instances of customers I've spoken to where that has been, could be legal cases, lawsuits and things because of a particular email that hasn't been found. So if we take a look at email management, we usually talk about four main areas of managing emails: to capture them into the right place, to be able to classify them so that they can be sorted, ordered, and managed effectively, but then so that you can actually discover them and reuse them, reply to them, forward them on, or whatever you need to do, or produce them as evidence in things. So I think the purpose of capturing and classifying is really serving the requirement to be able to discover them. And as I say, there's a number of different ways to actually achieve that. So we'd just like to ask you another poll question on what you're currently doing, what maybe your users are doing today to manage their emails, whether they're storing them in their personal mailboxes and maybe PST files. I think it's still reasonably widespread practice, which obviously you kind of generally want people to get away from. Using shared mailboxes, using public folders, obviously other features of Exchange, or using, for example, SharePoint to manage those emails, or some other document management system. I think almost everyone's responded, so thank you very much. And we can see about half the audience have said that actually it's mainly personal mailboxes and PST files that people are using. And I think that really is a problem, because, as I say, if those critical emails are only accessible by the recipient of the email, and they're tied up in either a personal mailbox, which nobody else has permission to access, or a PST file, which is typically local to somebody's laptop or desktop, then it really is, you're never going to find those. So let's take a look at the different options that kind of in the Microsoft world are available to you. A few new ones have kind of cropped up over the last few years as well, so we'll take a look at each of those in a little bit of detail. So I think, obviously historically, like you just said, most of the, or 50% of people are actually storing their emails in Exchange, in their personal mailboxes or PST files, and then potentially managing documents in SharePoint. I would hazard a guess that most of the people on this session today are using SharePoint in some form or looking to use SharePoint maybe for document management. But it really means that they are two completely separate interfaces in two completely different repositories. So if we take a look at the pros and cons of that approach, we can see that obviously people use Outlook. They've been using Outlook for many, many years. Most people in the workplace know how to use email. So most people devise their own methods for organizing their emails, but typically in folders, for example, because there isn't really a concept of metadata that users can add above kind of using a category or something. Also, people can use Outlook rules to configure like automation of, if I receive an email that has maybe a particular keyword or from a particular company or domain or something, then move it into a corresponding folder. But again, it's all in my own mailbox. And obviously, you can search both in SharePoint and you can search in Outlook. However, the content, as I say, is being stored in two distinctly different places. So it can be quite complex to actually find the content if you're looking for maybe everything that relates to a particular contract, for example. You're going to have to start looking in multiple places. It's going to take some time. And because, as I say, if we go back a second, because there's not really any concept of metadata in Exchange, it's actually quite difficult to find. So you are really reliant on the search in Outlook, and that can be a bit challenging. People's mailbox sizes can have limits on them, obviously. I think that's maybe a little less of an issue in Office 365 where you have more space generally. But that's another historically reason why a lot of people kind of put content into PST files to keep their mailbox small and within their limits. But then that's just basically offlining all of that data and making it even more difficult for anybody else to access. And therefore, as I say, those emails aren't visible to other people or somebody auditing the company, for example. And also attachments. They basically stay in the email, and you can't really find a document by the email that it was sent to. So you have to really think about, well, where did I get that email from, or where did I get the document from, and who sent it to me, and what was said in the email and stuff. So it's quite difficult and challenging. So I think something that was obviously introduced over the last year or two from Microsoft is the concept of using Teams. Teams is a great platform. It kind of brings together to some degree, documents in SharePoint and emails in Outlook. But it's actually still a lot of the same issues that we had in the previous scenario, where the emails are still in a mailbox and the documents are in a document library in SharePoint. There is, as I say, there's some link between the two in terms of they both belong to the same team or group, which is actually what's created underneath the team kind of architecture. So you still have that kind of disconnect of using two different interfaces, and there's no real easy way to move between them, and it's not very intuitive for end users. But it does mean that if you put, for example, a document in a team or an email in a group mailbox, then they are visible to the other members of that team. So it's kind of shared in some respect. It's very easy to create a team. Pretty much anybody can say, I want to create a new team. But then that kind of has its own challenges as well. And if we take a look at those challenges, as I say, the content is still stored in different places. So it's, again, if I want to find an email from the Teams interface, I have to go back into Outlook. And if I want to find a document from the Outlook interface, I have to go back into the Teams interface or SharePoint, which again is the underlying document repository for that team. Again, with emails, there's still the same limitations of no additional classification or metadata, and users need to manually move those emails between the mailboxes. And it's not so easy to kind of drag and drop. I think there's certain limitations at the moment between the web interface and the desktop interface, and it's not really a consistent way of working. So again, something that was introduced, I think, last year by Microsoft was the concept of labels in Office 365, which goes some way to kind of bridge that gap a little bit, because it's kind of like a special type of metadata that can apply to both Exchange and SharePoint. But there are limitations on that as well, that it's limited to, certainly at the moment, kind of two types of labels. Those labels can be used to apply retention policies, which is great. And obviously that's a key benefit of that, but it does mean that it's kind of generally a kind of blanket label that is applied to a whole set of emails or documents in a library, for example. It can't be really that granular. But a benefit is that it is available both in SharePoint and in Exchange as well. But there are, as I say, there are some limitations on it. Again, emails and documents are still stored in separate repositories. And some of the things like those automatic labels that get applied don't apply immediately. So they do take some time. It can take up to 7 days for a label to be applied to an email that's been received. Obviously, in the business world, a lot can happen in those 7 days. The last option is to have a single repository for both emails and documents with SharePoint. And SharePoint is obviously a platform that's geared towards collaboration and sharing information in a single place. So it makes a lot of sense to actually put those emails with the documents in SharePoint libraries together. Therefore, you can not only you've got one place, but you've also got the ability to have uniform metadata across the entire SharePoint library. So that can apply to both emails and documents. The permissions can be a lot more flexible. You've got a single interface to work with both documents and emails. You've got a single search to use. So there's a lot of benefits to doing that. One disadvantage to doing that is obviously you need to have some way to actually get the emails into SharePoint. And that's really where Harmony comes in. So the last poll question for today is we'd just like to see, based on the kind of the areas that we've just gone through, which of these capabilities that Microsoft have added are you planning to make use of? So Teams, labels, group mailboxes, or none of the above. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for responding. It looks like the winner there is Teams. I'm not surprised. I think most people have already started to look at how they can utilize Teams in a number of different ways, because also Teams kind of addresses a few other things around, obviously, chat and voice over IP and video conferencing and things as well. And as we said, as one of the benefits, it's very easy to get started with Teams. Basically enable it and away you go. But labels is kind of coming up, and I think there's a lot of interest in how those labels can be used, and I'm sure that's going to evolve over time. So the other thing on, if we look at which emails to save and when to save them, I think another question you need to ask yourself is, why are you saving those emails in a central repository? Is it because you need to be able to retrieve those emails and documents at a later date? 9 times out of 10, it clearly is the case. And so if you do, then being able to have a single repository for documents and emails together is a massive benefit, and also having that uniform metadata so you can organize and manage the content in the same way. Then obviously the SharePoint approach is really the best option there. If you don't need to retrieve them in the future, so for example, you're just really kind of archiving emails, then obviously emails in Exchange and using labels could be an option for you there. And the other side of that is that in order for any of those kind of initiatives to be successful, and getting people to actually use the platform in the best possible way, means that it needs to be easy for them to use. It needs to be an integrated environment that you can easily capture, classify, discover, and share all of the information together. I think that's something that obviously SharePoint on its own is somewhat lacking. So with that, we'd like to give you a short demonstration of kind of like the Harmony solution to that. So if we just bring up my Outlook, you can see here that obviously I've got my personal emails. I might also have, some other mailboxes that I've connected to and things as well. But being able to actually connect to my SharePoint environment directly from within a very nice integrated user interface means that I'm much more likely to use the platform. It's comfortable and easy for me to use. I can pretty much get running with it very, very easily and in a very straightforward way. And also we can see that not only can I access, individual SharePoint sites, but I can also access the teams and groups that I'm a member of. So again, the underlying SharePoint libraries that are related to those teams. So even if you are using teams and labels and things, Harmony just complements that in the best possible way. So if we go into one of our SharePoint sites there, we can see, for example, that I've got access to a number of SharePoint libraries, and I can easily drill down into those. Now, they could be libraries that are set up to manage emails on their own, or as we've been discussing, actually storing emails and documents together. So here we can see in this library, I've got a whole bunch of documents and emails in a single place. So if we take a look at kind of capturing that content first, we can see that I've just created an environment for today's session. And this email that I'm reading at the moment may actually be an important email because it's to do with, let's say in this case, the marketing budget that we're discussing for this year. So I actually want to capture that. I can very, very easily just do that by dragging and dropping the item into the sidebar. It's stored as a fully contained MSG file. It's given a unique name. So everything's done for the user without really having to fill in a lot of additional information. Now, what Harmony can do is map across all of the key information from the email itself. So it's already being added as metadata in the SharePoint library. But also there could be additional metadata that I want to add to that item. So again, we can use that consistent way of utilizing metadata to organize and manage the content in the SharePoint library, whether that's an email or a document, because it might be, for example, I've actually received some documentation as well. So likewise, I can drag and drop attachments in the same way. I can then choose the content type that you've got defined in SharePoint, and again fill in all the necessary metadata and things as well. So again, as I say, there might be specific metadata for this particular content type. Let's say I need to assign that to a particular user. But also it might be that I want to apply the same metadata that I applied to the email that I captured. So very easily I can see, common information that's being displayed across both emails and documents. I can easily search to retrieve information in a single place. And I can also use that metadata to, for example, create views and things in the SharePoint library. We can even create personal views from here directly from Harmony as well. And they could be focused, filtered, they could be displaying different types of metadata depending on the content that you're actually working in. But also you can retrieve that information. So I could, for example, let's take a look at that previous view where we've got the document, but I've also got the email. I can preview that information in one single place without having to switch user interfaces, without having to go and waste my time looking for that information. So it could be I'm actually, while I'm composing an email, I'm actually referencing some statistics in a spreadsheet, as well as the email that was sent to me or sent to a colleague, for example, because now it could be somebody else is opening that email up who has permission to access it and can reply to that email with the response. And maybe they need to send, for example, that spreadsheet that we just received as well. So very easily, you've got like a really nice flow of capturing, sharing, and classifying your content, both emails and documents, in a single user interface. Now, also something else that we're adding at the moment is we're working very closely with Microsoft to add more intelligence to the way that you're both capturing the content and classifying it, but also the way that you may need to discover the content as well. So if we just close that for a second, we can see that we've actually got what we call a kind of topics-based interface to identify information relating to key topics in your day-to-day work. So we can actually identify key topics. We can import those. We can learn them from the kind of emails and documents that you're working with. So for example, here it might be that I'm actually working on a particular, let's say, a digital workplace program or something, and I want to find out all the information across SharePoint, Exchange, OneDrive, and Teams that I've got access to see a kind of consistent view. So here we can see that actually there's a number of emails, some of which are already saved to SharePoint and some of which are in my mailbox at the moment in Exchange. So I can easily filter those down and say, okay, well, actually, I've got an email regarding this template. I could open that up and I can then save that to SharePoint. So Harmony is able to actually help me to decide what type of emails I should be saving to SharePoint. And so, for example, here as well, we can use those topics to actually suggest locations for you to save those to as well. So based on the topic, Harmony is able to tell me, okay, these are the emails that you've received that meet those criteria, related to that topic. Would you like to save them? And also, would you like to save them in one of the following locations? So we're actually using the Office graph to pick up, locations that you have been using in other Office applications, for example, but also the people that you're connected to in Office 365, people that are around you, locations that are using the same topics, for example, as metadata. We can actually suggest those locations for you to save that content to. So with that, we'd like to just go back to the presentation for a second. And if you'd like somebody from Harmony to contact you, then please respond to the poll accordingly.
And while people are responding to the poll, Richard, I will ask you the questions that have come in while you've been speaking. Does the add-in support pattern recognition? I think that means if you select an email in the inbox, recognition of the pattern from the subject. Can you put the pattern in the search bar and search for related cases?
You could do. I mean, obviously the search is utilizing the enterprise search service of SharePoint. So you can use wildcards and those kind of things. With regard to kind of topics that we're identifying and looking for, it's something that we're considering. So to be able to identify actual patterns and maybe masks of patterns and things in your emails to then present relevant information to you at that time based on the email that you selected.
Great. Does it work in Outlook Web Experience and on mobile?
Yeah, so obviously the sidebar that we've just been looking at is a COM-based add-in. It's a local install on the actual device. So it's nice and easy to deploy. It's an MSI package, and we've been doing that for many years. Obviously, Outlook in a browser is a different architecture. Outlook on mobile is also a different architecture, but we do have a solution for that as well. So because we realize that people are using Outlook in a browser and on mobile and still have the same or similar requirement to actually capture content. So for example, if I go into my web interface and let's go to Outlook in the browser, and let's just go to my demo environment there. We can see, for example, that if I select an email here, then Harmony also has an app available that allows me to actually capture the email or the attachment, if there's an attachment there, or both, into SharePoint and, for example, map the header information, fill in the metadata, check the document and email in, and then make it available to other users. So we do have a solution for that. It is a slightly different solution, but it does give you the basic capabilities of being able to say, okay, I want to take this email, I want to save it into a library or a team or something. So let's actually put it in this legal library here. And I can then, as I say, map the header information from the email automatically, like we can in the kind of full version of Harmony. But also I can fill in any additional metadata as well.
Great, thank you. When you reply to an email that is stored in a SharePoint library, is the reply stored in your personal mailbox or in SharePoint?
So when you're replying to an email, let's just go back to that kind of scenario because we kind of touched on it. So you've got this email in SharePoint now, and it might be, as I say, I wasn't the recipient of it, but one of my colleagues has saved it, and now I want to reply to it. So I open that up. It's a fully contained email. So now that's opened up in my Outlook. So if I hit reply, it's going to come from me. It's going to come from my Outlook and my Exchange account. But what we can do is we can say that I want to save my response to the same location as well. So obviously when I hit send, it's going to be in my sent items in Exchange, but also it will be saved into the same location that we stored the original email as well. So I can go ahead and save that. We can also, there's some mechanisms we can turn on that automatically do that, so that as long as the user has permission to access the same location, they don't even get prompted about that, and it will just automatically save into that same SharePoint library. So now we can see, if we just close those down, there's my original email, and there's my response. And obviously we can then create things like conversation type views, which have been grouped by the original subject or the conversation ID. And we can see, for example, excuse me, which of those, which email is which, and obviously the corresponding email, the metadata is coming across, and I can move through those in a nice kind of easy to read manner.
Great. Back to the previous, I think the repeat here is the Harmony mobile app compatible with both iOS and Android?
Okay, I mean, we haven't touched actually on the Harmony mobile app itself, which is a standalone app to give you rich access to SharePoint and the content there. It is available for both iOS and Android, and also obviously we are looking to integrate to Outlook on a mobile device as well, which should be coming shortly.
Great. There are more questions which I think we'll have you answer offline, because this way everybody gets a little bit of extra time in their day. But I promise you someone will reach out to you and get back to you if we haven't answered you. Richard, thank you for that presentation. Thank all of you for joining us today. You'll receive an email with the link to view the webinar again within a couple of days, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you.